Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's do another one of these, all right? Last time we ended up with the collapse of the Bronze Age. I noted that the Egyptians were really the only civilization to survive the Bronze Age. The Assyrians as well, but the Assyrians weren't quite as developed as the other ones that we noted, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Hittites. Um, It's not to say that some settlements were not continued to be inhabited. For instance, Athens is actually one Mycenaean settlement that continued to be inhabited. Nevertheless, we called it collapse because the lifestyle they knew fundamentally changed. Okay, we are emerging into another period, the Dark Age. So here are some terms to think about. Dark Age, regionalism, bard, geometric, 776 BCE, Diplon vase, colonialism, and Homer. No doubt some of these look familiar to you. Nevertheless, I hope to add a little insight to what might be some previous knowledge. And here is our scale timeline once again. We talked about this last time, the Bronze Age, with special attention to the late Bronze Age. We're going to look at this green time now, which is the Iron Age, also called the Dark Age. So we are going to celebrate that. We're going to celebrate this time period that has been identified a Dark Age. You hear of other Dark Ages as well. Middle Ages, also kind of called a Dark Age. And the reason for this generally is because the absence of writing. So as we look at 750 BC, it is no coincidence that this is the time period in which writing will reemerge in Greece. Recall that writing was a part of the late Bronze Age for a little while there. They took the alphabet from the Minoans as they facilitated their collapse. One of the things they brought back with them. And we could read some of the tablets. Most of the tablets are collections of data and lists and things like that. And we looked at things, we looked at sort of the king's land holdings and what was on there. We noted lists of people, which included slaves and women and young boys, adult men being absent from that list, which is a peculiar omission. All right. Let's move. Let's start with a map. This is maybe a pretty familiar looking Mediterranean map. This is the mainland of Greece that we are really talking about now. You can call this Greece as well. This will become Greece as well. We're going to look at colonialism, this expansion that happens at the end of the Dark Age, beginning of the Archaic period. And we're going to look at colonies that are set up across the Mediterranean as well. But again, this map is deceptive. This map suggests that the Mediterranean is just a place. It is a theater as opposed to a performer. And what I'd like to suggest to you before we really get into the Dark Age is that the Mediterranean is more than a theater. It is a performer as well. What do I mean by that? Let's look at this map. I love this map. It's one of those maps that you got in a National Geographic once upon a time. Those are like the greatest maps. I don't know if they continue to do that. But here you have a physical map which doesn't only show the land, but the contours of the Mediterranean Sea as well. It's so exciting. It is just tortured. Look at this. Look at how rugged and rough that is. Right here. Actually, I won't get into that quite yet. Before we get into the sea, let's look at this one here. Another physical map, the reddish brown areas showing you the mountainous elevated period pieces, and you'll see, if this is the mainland of Greece, much of it is covered, which puts a premium on these greener spaces, the valleys and the plains, which allowed for intensive agriculture. There's a plain here that separates Thebes and Athens, and this plain was hotly contested between the two. And you see in general, there are actually quite a bit of plains in the Thebes area. This larger region is actually called Boeotia, and there are a lot of plains there. In fact, this is really where you could have a lot of horses. Horses, it's hard to have a horse in this area. If you did, it was definitely a statement of status. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why Thebes is hated so much. Athens has won the culture wars, okay? Most of the material that we get today that is quote-unquote Greek really arrives from Athenian interests, for the most part. So it is no... it's not unpredictable that they would cast Thebes in a negative light, which in some part characterizes or explains why Thebes is hated in iniquity. There are some real other reasons as well that are quite historic and not just cultural. All right, let's move. I mentioned the Calypso Deep. It's right here. So this is our peninsula again, right over here. So right off of that, you have the Calypso Deep. This is the deepest part of the Mediterranean. We are talking about over 17,000 feet deep, 3,000 miles deep. Just for context, I think Mount Rainier is like about 14,400 feet high. So this is Mount Rainier plus another 3,000 feet deep. Super deep. As you can imagine, not just this, but this tortured geography really provided a difficult sea to navigate. And by the way, if you look on a map, you really don't see Mediterranean Sea, quote unquote. Mediterranean Sea is actually made up of numerous seas. Here's the Aegean, okay, the Ionian, the Adriatic, the Tyrrhenian, the Ligurian. So there's all sorts of seas that sort of make up the Mediterranean Sea, by the way, important to note. A lot of times we'll talk about the Aegean, because that's this area right here, which really is the hub of the Greek world. Okay, sea circulation. So based on that sort of tortured landscape, seascape rather, here you have how the circulations of the sea work. You can see how difficult this would be to navigate. And with navigation, on account of the complexities here, you really wanted to stay to shore. So for instance, if you're in Greece here, let's say you want to go to northern Africa. This is modern day Tunisia. This will be Carthage later on during the Roman Republic. But you might take this area up. Maybe you have to circle around this way somehow. Come here and then do something like that, potentially. Or maybe you want to go with the flow and just do it this way. I really don't know. There are some actually older Greek literature pieces that showed how individuals navigated the sea, written for ship captains, as you can imagine. But you generally stuck close to the shores for fear of the dangers of the sea, which were sort of personified or captured in the construction of monsters, which we'll take a moment to talk about as well. Before that, though, we're still looking at the problems with this area, all right? And again, this is not a theater. This is not sort of a benign backdrop where Greeks played out their dramas, all right? You have a hateful sea at times, And you have, look at the landscape here. Okay. Or again, the tectonic plates. Here you have the African plate. It's pushing up this way. Eurasian plate pushing down that way. The Arabian plate pushing up this way. Anatolian plate pushing up that way. It's all really coming on Greece right here. And then you have this Aegean plate as well, right? What a place. Again, this is not a landscape that is just a backdrop. It is impacting the lives, the imaginations of Greeks at this time and today. All right. So you definitely get this construction of sea monsters, perhaps most notably the Scylla and the Charybdis. The Scylla and the Charybdis actually historically are identified on the Straits of Messina. That is that little area between the boot of Italy and the football that it's kicking. That is Sicily. So Scylla, Sicily, and Calabria, that province of Italy. Charybdis is how they ultimately put that together. Construction of sea monsters. The way in which the landscape plays in the imaginations and storytellings of the Greeks. Not the only example. And so here we are back at the map. So this strait right here would be the Scylla and the Charybdis. Okay. This will be the land of the Cyclops, the island of the Cyclops right here. We'll visit that a little bit later on. So here's a Dark Age map. I promised you the Dark Age. So again, with a brief discussion of the Mediterranean as both theater to the exploits of Greeks, but also performer. Now let's look at Dark Age Greece in general. Seeing definitely some familiar names. Within the Dark Age, we do see Sparta becoming a more prominent settlement, due in large part to the collapse of the other settlements, no doubt receiving immigrants from other places based on the sort of dislocations of people that follow such collapses. Here we have Athens and Thebes. Again, I noted that there's a beautiful little plain there, so tantalizing and contested. And I mentioned Boeotia being that sort of region. Sometimes you hear the word Attica, and that just means Athens, but then also sort of the land surrounding it. Lefkandi is perhaps the most interesting and important city, or settlement rather, in Dark Age Greece. I'm just going to leave that for a potential question for you to follow up on later on, and keep this hopefully under 45 minutes this time. But check it out, Lefkandi, remarkable place, and really not so important earlier in Greek history, not so important later on. But at this moment, in the Dark Age, even the earlier Dark Age of Greece, really remarkable finding there. Okay. Let's move. Let's look at the pottery, and let's sort of trace, let's use sort of a pottery to understand sort of change over time during the Dark Age. And here we have the earlier Dark Age, and we have the emergence of geometric pottery. You will recall I showed you at least one Mycenaean vessel in the last presentation, and it had figurative art, right? It had sort of Mycenaean soldiers. That particular pot is placed around 1200 to 1150, so it really represents the end of the Bronze Age. Here, not long afterwards, we see a complete absence of figurative art on the pots. So this is one example of sort of the loss of technology that happened during the Dark Age. And you can see how there's sort of an attempt. You can see the bands that are made here. There's an attempt to employ different, especially curvature shapes. Okay. This is sort of proto-geometric and also early geometric pottery. As we sort of progress, ultimately, in large part, the curvature elements are abandoned. Here we have what's called a meander. The meander is very popular. It just fits the space very nicely. You get these bands that sort of separate the different parts of the vessel. Some diamonds, beautiful diamonds. Just a beautiful reproduction of the geometric patterns. So people are really starting to master this geometric form. And this is middle geometric. So we're talking about maybe 950 to 800, 825. Okay. All right, now we get a little bit more sophisticated. You see the reemergence of some of these more circular motifs combined with these meanders. We're starting to get some imagery. Here we have a fish. Here we have a horse. It's hard to tell what's on that side. Here we have another beautiful panel, beautiful, elaborate panel, starting to tell narrative, right? And this is actually what's called a crater. This would have, it's basically sort of a headstone for an individual who had passed away, a grave marker. So as you can imagine, some of these would be really big. The crater was used for females, and the amphora, which we'll see next, is used for males. So this would have indicated a female burial. Beautiful images. Here I wanted to capture a nice little image. We're starting to get, again, figurative art, though the figurative art is very geometric, right? Like these torsos are these upside down triangles, very simple patterns, and oftentimes sort of, as these are here, reproduced almost in a geometric form, right? So it's almost taking the style of the meander, but using individuals. So we have this reemergence of the individual, the figurative art, which is really exciting toward the end of this dark age. We're getting there. Here you have wrestlers. So within this period, you have the emergence of the Olympics. Just a quick note on that. 776 BCE, that's the significance of the date of the first Olympic Games, first Pan-Hellenic event. And so if you were Greek, you were invited to participate, abandon your wars. As I've already kind of noted, Greeks didn't have that sense of unity that the Romans will eventually have. Really divided by the different, what will become city-states. So the different settlements really, almost like planting and harvesting, warfare was also just a periodic element of the annual cycle. So the Olympics marked the event once every 4 years in which you would then stop the battling and come and compete in athletic contests. Some athletic contests were similar. There are others that are profoundly different. I didn't note this as a question at the end, but you might actually pursue that. What were the events of the early Greek Olympics? Not just those at 776, but even later in Greek antiquity, really some interesting events. All right. And by the way, what constitutes a Greek? You spoke Greek, and you subscribe to the Greek pantheon, right? You trace sort of your roots to, this is a city of Hera, this is a city of Athena. Okay, those are really the two major elements. Geographically, you also lived, within Greece. Okay, which we've already noted is pretty expansive. All right. here we've now reached the really the epitome of geometric pottery. This is the Dipolon vase, and it's huge. First of all, this is 5'1", okay, perhaps taller than some of you, close to as tall as I am. Okay, it is big, and it is absolutely stunning. You can sort of pursue other images as well. I chose to sort of blow up this band, but we could have looked at other things as well. The meanders, these black bands that sort of also separate the different parts. These are, you can't tell, but deer. It's unclear what animals these are. These are either deer that are laying down or potentially goats. Again, sort of reproduced in sort of a geometric way, right? So while we have figurative art as well, they're created with these sorts of simple shapes. Interestingly, okay, so this is an amphora. It would mark a male grave. Interestingly, though, we very clearly have a woman who is on this sort of funeral pyre, all right? And these individuals around are women who are mourning. What they're doing is they're pulling at their hair and they're scarring their faces. It's hard to tell, but there are little elements that are dripping here. Some have suggested these are tears. Some have suggested they are even blood from potentially ripping at the faces. It's a very peculiar, certainly grief is real. And at the same time, it's very interesting that the cultural expression of this grief among women was to tear at their hair and scar their faces. So ultimately, this was deemed by the emerging city-states in which we have here as a dangerous activity and restricted, and women were not allowed to perform this. And it was not for the protection of the women, it was for the protection of the settlement or the emerging city-state. So my suggestion to you is, how does limiting or restricting this practice in protection of the state? It's I find the question interesting. I offer it to you. Okay. Well, let's continue to move. So here we've arrived then at 750 BCE, around the time of the Dipolon vase. What else is happening? This is the beginning of really the colonial period for the Greeks. The Phoenicians had started a little bit earlier on. Here's Phoenicia, or the Phoenician settlement. Tyre and Sidon are some important cities. Again, if you know your Hebrew Bible, or even New Testament, you've perhaps heard of these important cities of Tyre and Sidon. And Phoenicians set up settlements all over the place, as well as did the Greeks around 750. So they were a little later to the game. It's the great Mediterranean land grab, and it's fought largely between the Greeks and the Phoenicians, although I wish they would have included the Etruscans here, right, in this part of Italy, in a city called Volki, from which we'll get the Greek god Vulcan, who the Greeks will adopt. That's not initially a Greek god, and call him Hephaestus. But you have this awesome metalworking civilization, the Etruscans, who also are participating in this land grab. Rome will have a monarchy, and the early kings, or the early royalty for these Roman monarchy, will be Etruscans, actually. Important. Okay, but we aren't talking about them. Here we have land grab. So again, Scylla and Charybdis, you can see these become Greek settlements. Part of Sicily, which will be our land of the Cyclops, which we'll talk about a little bit later. and they're setting up settlements all over the place. It reminds me of like Capitol Hill. Like if there's a vacant area, you best believe Seattle Academy and Seattle U are going to fight all over that piece. It's like the Capitol Hill land grab, except it's not. It is the Mediterranean land grab. So imagine this is a time of great dislocation, people moving all over the place. There's excitement, there's anxieties. And as you can imagine, this also played out in the arts. I don't think I'm getting there quite yet, because we have to talk about writing first. So 750 BC, the Diplon vase, this reemergence of beautiful figurative art. The person is important once again. The Phoenicians are really traders in the Greek or the ancient world, and the Phoenicians will ultimately share an alphabet with the Greeks that allow them to write once again. So here you see the Greek alphabet. This is, or the Phoenician alphabet. This is called an aleph, just as it is in Hebrew, aleph. And the Greeks will take it. It gets modified, and this is alpha. Bet, beta, gimel, gamma. Okay, so these are traded, and they aren't just traded and adopted wholesale. They're changed a little bit, but you can see how they're very similar, right? And then even to us today in Latin, you have a, right? Gimel, reminiscent of camel, and then gamma, right? Okay. Anyway, there's all sorts of really cool stuff. If you are into languages, the development of languages, how these sort of arrived initially from pictures, like this right here would be one of those words escaping my my mind, but these sort of things that you put on an ox to plow. That's what that is. All right. Boustrophodon. This is how you would read early Greek. You would start, and you'd move generally left to right. And then when you hit this corner, you would just continue to read that direction. All right? So boustrophodon. So essentially, as the ox plows, you read. This makes a lot of sense. I feel like if we read like this, and if I was trained to read like this, I feel like I could read a lot faster. Like the wasted time resetting on the left side makes no sense. All right, what else? So we have language. We have a written language now. And what we get is the inscription of these tales that bards, these traveling singers and storytellers, told. And among these tales, we get the Odyssey and the Iliad. Starting with the Iliad, that's that epic battle that took place between the Mycenaeans, the collaborative effort to sack Troy, because purportedly the Trojan prince had stolen Helen, the most beautiful girl in the Greek world. Some people believe that's a metaphor for the beautiful lands in which Troy possessed and was sort of a keeper of. But you have these bards that are traveling from city to city. So imagine, they are telling stories from the past. They are also needing to adapt their stories to their local audiences. You can't go to Sparta and tell a story in which the Athenians are the heroes. You just can't do that, right? So the bard is not only attempting to relate these awesome stories from the past, even with some fidelity, but at the same time, needing to tweak the story to adapt to the audience. Homer, whether this was an individual or not, is regarded largely as blind. You see this trope a lot, not just in ancient Greece, but elsewhere, this idea that these storytellers are blind. It's like storytellers have this sort of inner vision or insight, and just playing with that image of being blind, visually blind, but at the same time having this sort of deep insight, and sharing that with others. So you see that sort of trope among storytellers. So Homer, 750 BC. Another writer emerged around 750 BC. His name is Hesiod. Again, in view of time, I'm not going to talk about Hesiod, but I will challenge you to research. Who is this guy Hesiod? Why is he not garnered as much sort of fame as Homer? What did he write? How is it similar? How is it different? Some important questions. All right. Personally, well, not to disparage Homer, but yeah, I like Hesiod's works better. Okay. For whatever that's worth. Okay. Here we go. And I kind of mentioned sort of the way in which you tell a story in the past, but also need to modernize it in the present. And the Odyssey being just a great example of that. Mentioned the Iliad, that sort of battle that happens right here in Troy, and the belief that they were sort of the possessor of this fertile, beautiful area beyond that. Or maybe they just stole a woman. Or maybe there's a third thing that happened. What we do know is there was an epic battle in the late Bronze Age in Troy. It is destruction layer 7A. And you can sort of tell with archaeology, get a sense of how that era came to an end. And 7A was a violent end. So there is archaeological evidence to suggest an epic battle that happened right at the time that Homer suggests it. Anywho, here we have the travels of the Odyssey. So keep in mind this time of colonialism. So it really, the Odyssey really captures what's going on at that very time in Greece, and at the same time tries to tell a story that happens in the late Bronze Age. It's that tension. So I'm not teaching you Antigone, but it's important to think about. Yes, Sophocles on the one hand is using a cast of characters in the landscape from the Bronze Age. At the same time, he's making claims about the present. What in the world is he saying? It's really the historian's task to figure out in what ways it's characterizing the past, accurately or inaccurately, and to one extent, what sort of commentary, what sort of political commentary are they offering in the present? Really important. Okay, here we are in the land of the Cyclops. Let's go there for a moment, just as another example of the way in which a storyteller can tell a modern story, but then also use sort of motifs of the Bronze Age past. The beautiful Sicilian landscape. You, as a Greek colonist, are adventuring to these different parts, and you encounter this, and you're like, whoa, it's so beautiful. Imagine if Greeks had such land. I already kind of noted this, but the Greek landscape is rugged, it's vertical, it's dry, it's rough. There are places like this, again, in Greece, I kind of mentioned it, very few, and they are hotly contested. It's really the motivator for most warfare in ancient Greece, control over these fertile plains. So imagine you chance upon one of these, and you're like, think of the farms. Think of what we could do with this. And then you see, okay, this is what you're imagining, the farms. And then you see a bunch of sheep. And you're like, these sheep, I can have these sheep on my mountains. Why in the world does this landscape have these sheep? Therefore, you create stories about idiot monsters who rule a landscape of sheep. And by the way, they eat humans. They're not very smart. They possess the greatest land, yet use it for dumb sheep, which you can really have anywhere. That story of dispossession is actually pretty modern, pretty familiar as well. This idea of the quote-unquote savage who is not intelligent, doesn't understand their landscape, and using that as sort of leverage or means to dispossess and acquire. That's part of the Greek storytelling as well. You don't get that in the Greek records. There's no record that talks about sort of genocidal tactics or what the Greeks did abroad in order to dispossess the lands and take those over. It's sort of regarded as a progress narrative of the city-state beginning to emerge, the population boom, the need to branch out, the explosion of trade, the increase in arts, the emergence of literature, and a lot of those things, well, those things are true. And at the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that dispossession was a prerequisite for those things to happen. And it's not a part of the historical record. And at the same time, is a story that needs to be told. So here we are at 750. This may very well be my last slide. I'm not sure, so I'm going to make my closing statements here. But here we are at 750. We are sort of on the precipice of the city-state. What was a centralized system in the citadels and the palaces was replaced by regionalism, in which you didn't have these big centers for distribution. You had small local settlements that characterizes the Dark Age, and now these settlements are turning into polis, P-O-L-E-I-S, polis, which is plural for polis. So at 750 BC, as we move forward, we're really going to get the emergence of the polis. And I mentioned some questions that you might look at. Lefkendi, what is it? Why is it so important? Pulling one's hair, okay? They are grieving, and at the same time, that cultural expression is a peculiar one. What were the social functions of that, do you think? Why was that considered a dangerous tactic? If it was dangerous just for the women, best believe it wouldn't have been restricted, but it was dangerous for the state as well. Hesiod began writing at the same time as Homer. What did he write about? And why is he cooler than Homer? You may have your own questions, and sort of I really encourage you to think of what those questions are, bring them to class so we can talk about not just these, but, you know, how are you being inspired? What are you thinking about this? All right. Enough. I look forward to seeing you next time.